In the beginning, there was silence. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, two islands floated in pristine isolation, untouched by human footsteps for millions upon millions of years. These islands, which would one day be called Aotearoa, New Zealand, existed as a living laboratory of evolution, a place where nature had written its own extraordinary story without interference from mankind. The very formation of these islands tells a tale of geological drama that spans eons. Born from the collision of massive tectonic plates, the land that would become New Zealand emerged from the ocean depths through countless volcanic eruptions and seismic upheavals. The South Island's backbone, the Southern Alps, rose like a great spine through the center of the land, their peaks carved by glaciers into sharp ridges and deep valleys that would one day take the breath away from all who beheld them. Picture, if you will, a land where giant birds ruled supreme. The moa, towering creatures that could reach heights of 12 feet, wandered through dense forests of kori and rimu trees that had grown undisturbed for centuries. These magnificent flightless birds, some as massive as small elephants, grazed peacefully in valleys that echoed only with their calls and the whisper of wind through ancient leaves. There were no predators to fear, no mammals to compete with, save for the occasional bat that had somehow found its way across the ocean depths. The moa themselves were a marvel of evolutionary adaptation. Different species had evolved to fill various ecological niches across the islands. Some were browsers, stretching their long necks to reach leaves high in the forest canopy. Others were grazers, their powerful beaks perfectly designed for cropping grasses and low shrubs. The largest species, the South Island giant moa, stood taller than any human would ever grow, their massive legs carrying them across the landscape with surprising grace despite their enormous size. These remarkable birds had developed behaviors and characteristics that spoke to their complete freedom from predation. They showed no wariness, no instinctive fear responses that might have protected them from danger. Their nests were simple scrapes in the ground, their eggs massive and vulnerable, laid with the confidence of creatures that had never known threat. The young moa chicks, covered in striped down that provided camouflage among the forest shadows, grew slowly and deliberately, taking years to reach their full magnificent size. The forests themselves were cathedral-like in their majesty. Massive kori trees, some already thousands of years old, stretched their crowns toward the sky, their trunks so wide that dozens of people, holding hands, could not encircle them. These ancient giants had witnessed the slow dance of geological time, surviving ice ages and volcanic eruptions, their growth rings recording centuries of climate change and natural cycles that no human eye had ever observed. Beneath their canopy, a world of ferns unfurled in prehistoric splendor. Tree ferns rose like green umbrellas, creating a layered landscape that seemed to belong more to the age of dinosaurs than to any world humans might recognize. The understory was a maze of fallen logs slowly returning to the earth, their decay providing nutrients for countless generations of new growth. Mosses and lichens covered every surface, creating a carpet of green that muffled sound and retained moisture, maintaining the humid microclimate that these ancient forests required. The diversity of fern species alone was staggering. From tiny filmy ferns that grew in the dampest crevices to massive tree ferns with fronds that spread like giant parasols, these plants had diversified into forms found nowhere else on Earth. Some had evolved to climb the massive tree trunks, creating living curtains of green that filtered the forest light into a soft, emerald glow. Others had adapted to life in the canopy itself, their roots never touching the ground as they drew moisture and nutrients from the air itself. In this primeval paradise, the ground was carpeted with creatures that had evolved in splendid isolation. The takale, a flightless rail with brilliant blue and green plumage, picked its way through the undergrowth alongside the smaller, but equally remarkable kiwi, a bird so unusual that it seemed designed by nature's most whimsical imagination. The kiwi, with its long curved beak, hair like feathers, and nocturnal habits, had evolved to fill the ecological niche that in other lands might have been occupied by small mammals. Weta, insects the size of mice, crawled through the leaf litter, their ancient lineage stretching back to the time when these islands first broke away from the great southern continent of Gondwana. These remarkable creatures, some as large as a human hand had evolved into numerous species, each adapted to different aspects of the forest environment. Some lived in trees, others in caves, and still others in the ground itself. Their presence spoke to the incredible age and isolation of these islands, for Weta were living fossils, representatives of insect groups that had vanished from most other parts of the world. The absence of mammals created an ecological tapestry, unlike anywhere else on Earth. Without the pressure of mammalian predators or competitors, birds had evolved to fill every conceivable niche. Some became giants, others became flightless, and many developed behaviors and characteristics that would seem impossible in a world where mammals dominated. The very concept of fear was foreign to many of these creatures, for they had never known a predator capable of threatening their existence. Ground-dwelling birds had evolved into forms that would seem fantastical to observers from other lands. The weka, a bold and curious rail, had developed an almost mammal-like intelligence and adaptability. These birds would investigate anything new in their territory with fearless curiosity, their problem-solving abilities rivaling those of many mammals. They had learned to use tools to cache food for later consumption, and to adapt their behavior to take advantage of new opportunities. The forests rang with bird calls that had never been heard by human ears. The haunting cry of the kokako, a bird whose voice could carry for miles through the dense forest, created a soundtrack for this primeval world. The melodious songs of the tui and bellbird filled the air with music of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Each species had evolved its own unique voice, its own contribution to the symphony of sounds that characterized these ancient woodlands. Along the coastlines, seals basked on rocky shores while penguins nested in coastal forests, an arrangement that spoke to the unique character of these isolated lands. The New Zealand fur seals had established colonies on beaches and rocky headlands where they could haul out safely, their only concern the occasional leopard seal that might venture close to shore from the sub-Antarctic waters. The penguins, including species found nowhere else on Earth, had adapted to nesting in the coastal forests, an unusual behavior that reflected the absence of land-based predators. The marine environment surrounding these islands was equally remarkable. The waters teemed with fish and marine life that had evolved in isolation, creating underwater ecosystems of extraordinary diversity and abundance. Ancient fish species that had vanished from other parts of the world continued to thrive in these southern waters. The coastal kelp forests provided habitat for countless species of fish, shellfish, and other marine creatures, creating underwater cathedrals that rivaled the terrestrial forests in their complexity and beauty. The absence of large land predators meant that even the smallest creatures could thrive in ways impossible elsewhere on the planet. Native frogs, among the most primitive in the world, had survived since the time when these islands were part of Gondwana. These tiny amphibians had no tadpole stage, developing directly from egg to adult, a characteristic that spoke to their ancient origins and long isolation. This was the world that existed in perfect equilibrium, a biological treasure trove that had been developing its own unique character for 80 million years. The very rocks beneath this paradise told stories of volcanic upheaval and geological drama, of mountains thrust up from the sea and valleys carved by glaciers and rivers. The South Island's spine of mountains, the Southern Alps, stood like sentinels over a land that knew no human voice, no human touch, no human dreams. The geological history written in these rocks revealed a land that had experienced dramatic changes over millions of years. Ancient marine fossils found high in the mountains told of times when much of the land lay beneath the sea. Volcanic deposits spoke of periods of intense geological activity when the very shape of the islands was transformed by fire and molten rock. Glacial moraines and carved valleys revealed the power of ice ages that had repeatedly covered much of the South Island in glaciers that ground down mountains and carved out the deep fjords and lakes that would one day be considered among the most beautiful landscapes on Earth. The climate of these isolated islands was shaped by their position in the Southern Ocean, surrounded by vast expanses of water that moderated temperature extremes and brought regular rainfall to most regions. The prevailing westerly winds, unobstructed by any other landmass for thousands of miles, brought moisture, laden air that created the lush rainforests of the western coasts, while leaving the eastern regions in rain shadows that supported different types of vegetation. But far across the Pacific, in the scattered islands of Polynesia, a different kind of story was unfolding. Here, among the coral atolls and volcanic peaks of what we now call the Central Pacific, a remarkable civilization was taking shape. The Polynesian people had already achieved something that would challenge every assumption about ancient seafaring capabilities. They had mastered the art of ocean navigation to a degree that would not be matched by European explorers for many centuries to come. The origins of the Polynesian people themselves represented one of humanity's greatest migrations. Their ancestors had begun their journey thousands of years earlier in Southeast Asia, gradually spreading eastward through the islands of Melanesia and into the Central Pacific. Each step of this migration required not just courage and seamanship, but also the ability to establish successful colonies on islands that often had no previous human inhabitants. These were not primitive island dwellers eking out a simple existence. They were sophisticated navigators, astronomers, and boat builders whose knowledge of the sea was so profound that they could read the ocean like a vast, living map. Their society was complex and highly organized, with specialized classes of navigators, priests, craftsmen, and warriors. The knowledge required for long-distance ocean voyaging was closely guarded and passed down through generations of training that began in childhood and continued throughout a navigator's lifetime. Their double-hulled voyaging canoes, called wakaharua, were marvels of engineering and craftsmanship, capable of carrying entire families across thousands of miles of open ocean with remarkable speed and stability. The construction of these vessels required not just technical skill, but also deep knowledge of materials, weather patterns, and the stresses that ocean voyaging would place on every joint and lashing. The hulls were carved from massive trees, shaped with stone tools to precise specifications that had been refined over generations of experience. The design of these voyaging canoes represented a perfect balance between conflicting requirements. They needed to be large enough to carry substantial loads of people and supplies, yet light enough to maintain speed and maneuverability. They had to be strong enough to withstand the pounding of ocean waves, yet flexible enough to bend with the sea rather than breaking under stress. The twin-hulled design provided stability that no single hulled vessel could match, while the platform built between the hulls created living and working space that made long voyages bearable for entire families. The Polynesian navigators possessed a mental atlas of the Pacific that encompassed thousands of islands scattered across an area larger than all the continents combined. This knowledge was not recorded in charts or maps, but was carried in the minds of master navigators who had spent decades learning the intricate relationships between stars, currents, weather patterns, and island locations. The training of a navigator was a lifelong process that required not just memorization of vast amounts of information, but also the development of intuitive skills that allowed them to sense their position and direction, even when conventional landmarks were absent. They could read the stars with the precision of a modern GPS system, understanding not just the major constellations, but the subtle movements of individual stars throughout the year. They knew how different stars would appear at different latitudes, how to use the rising and setting points of celestial bodies to maintain course across weeks of ocean travel. Their star compass was a mental construct of extraordinary complexity, dividing the horizon into numerous directional segments, each associated with specific stars and their seasonal movements. The navigational knowledge went far beyond simple star positions. The navigators understood the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes star positions to shift over centuries. They knew how to adjust their star compass for different seasons and different latitudes. They could use the Southern Cross, the Pleiades, Orion, and dozens of other stellar markers to maintain precise courses across thousands of miles of featureless ocean. But their knowledge extended far beyond astronomy. They could read the ocean itself in ways that seem almost supernatural to modern minds. The navigators could detect the presence of distant islands by observing the behavior of waves, understanding how swells would refract and reflect when they encountered land masses dozens of miles away. They knew that waves from different directions would interact in predictable patterns, creating interference waves that could be felt even when they could not be seen. The ability to read wave patterns required years of training and experience. Navigators learned to distinguish between wind waves created by local weather and the long, regular swells that traveled across entire ocean basins. They understood how these swells would bend around islands, creating distinctive patterns that could be detected by experienced hands trailing in the water or by the subtle motion of the canoe itself. Some navigators became so skilled that they could detect the presence of land while still a full day's sailing away. They could interpret the flight patterns of seabirds, knowing which species would venture far from land and which would always return to roost, using these living compasses to guide them toward unseen shores. Different species of birds had different ranges and behaviors, and experienced navigators knew them all. Frigate birds might range far from land during the day, but would always return to roost, their evening flight pointing the way to islands beyond the horizon. Boobies and other seabirds had their own patterns and ranges, each providing different clues about the location and direction of land. The behavior of marine life also provided navigational information. Certain species of fish were associated with particular types of underwater terrain. The presence of dolphins might indicate the location of underwater ridges or seamounts. Even the color and clarity of the water itself could provide clues about depth, currents, and proximity to land. The color of the water itself told them stories. They could distinguish between the deep blue of the open ocean and the subtle green tinge that indicated the presence of a shallow lagoon or reef system beyond the horizon. They understood how suspended sediments from rivers and streams would change the color of coastal waters, creating telltale signs that could be detected from great distances. The phosphorescence of the water at night could indicate the presence of different types of marine life, each associated with particular ocean conditions. They understood how clouds would form differently over land masses, creating distinctive patterns that an experienced navigator could read like signposts in the sky. Islands created their own weather patterns, generating clouds that would form in characteristic shapes and positions. The color of clouds could indicate what lay beneath them, with the green reflection of shallow lagoons or the white glare of coral beaches visible in the undersides of clouds long before the land itself came into view. These master navigators also possessed an intimate knowledge of weather patterns, seasonal winds, and ocean currents that allowed them to plan voyages with remarkable precision. They knew when the trade winds would be most favorable, when the seasonal reversals would occur, and how to use the great circular currents of the Pacific to their advantage. This was not mere folklore or superstition, but a sophisticated understanding of oceanography and meteorology that had been refined over generations of practical experience. The seasonal patterns of the Pacific were complex and varied across different regions. The navigators understood the monsoon cycles, the seasonal shifts in wind direction that could make the difference between a successful voyage and disaster. They knew when the cyclone seasons would bring dangerous storms and when the trade winds would blow most steadily. They could predict seasonal changes in current strength and direction, using this knowledge to plan voyages that would take advantage of favorable conditions while avoiding dangerous weather. The voyaging canoes themselves were technological marvels that represented centuries of refinement and innovation. The double-hulled design provided extraordinary stability in rough seas while maintaining the speed necessary for long-distance travel. These vessels could carry not just people, but everything needed to establish a new colony: food plants, domestic animals, tools, and cultural treasures. The hulls were lashed together with coconut fiber, rope in a flexible design that could flex with the waves, rather than fighting them, a principle of engineering that wouldn't be fully understood by Western naval architects for many centuries. The construction techniques used in building these canoes represented some of the most sophisticated woodworking technology in the ancient world. The hulls were carved from single massive trees, shaped with stone adzes to precise curves that had been perfected over generations. The joints were fitted with extraordinary precision, sealed with plant resins and other natural materials that made them watertight even under the extreme stresses of ocean voyaging. The largest of these voyaging canoes could stretch over 100 feet in length and carry dozens of people, along with all their supplies. They were equipped with distinctive claw, shaped sails woven from pandanus leaves. Sails that could be quickly adjusted to catch even the lightest breeze or to handle the fury of a Pacific storm. The platforms built between the hulls provided living space, storage areas, and working surfaces where daily life could continue even during the longest voyages. The sails themselves were marvels of textile technology. Woven from strips of pandanus leaves that had been carefully prepared and treated, they were both flexible and strong, capable of withstanding the constant stress of ocean winds while remaining light enough to be easily handled by the crew. The distinctive claw shape allowed for efficient sailing at different angles to the wind, while the modular construction meant that damaged sections could be quickly repaired or replaced even while at sea. For over 1,000 years, these remarkable seafarers had been spreading across the Pacific, island by island, following a great eastward migration that had carried them from the shores of Southeast Asia to the far reaches of Polynesia. They had settled the Marquesas Islands, the Society Islands including Tahiti, the Cook Islands, and dozens of other island groups, each settlement representing a triumph of navigation, seamanship, and human courage. Each stage of this great migration had required not just the ability to find new islands, but also the skills necessary to establish successful colonies. The Polynesian settlers had to bring with them everything needed to create a new society: the plants and animals that would provide food, the tools and materials needed for construction and crafts, and most importantly, the cultural knowledge that would allow them to maintain their identity and social organization in a new environment. The success of Polynesian colonization depended on careful planning and preparation. The selection of colonists required balancing the need for essential skills with the genetic diversity necessary for a founding population. Each voyage had to include not just navigators and sailors, but also farmers, craftsmen, priests, and healers. Women were essential participants, bringing not only their own specialized knowledge, but also the reproductive potential necessary for population growth. By around 1,000 years ago, these Polynesian explorers had reached the limits of the habitable Pacific. They had discovered and settled virtually every island capable of supporting human life across an ocean that covers nearly 1/3 of the Earth's surface. But the greatest challenge still lay ahead of them, hidden beyond the southern horizon in waters that few, if any, had ever explored. The decision to venture into these unknown southern waters would not have been made lightly. The Polynesian navigators understood better than anyone the risks involved in exploring beyond the edges of their known world. They knew that the Southern Ocean held different weather patterns, different seasonal rhythms, and potentially different dangers than the tropical waters they knew so well. The Southern Pacific represented a fundamentally different environment from the tropical and subtropical waters where Polynesian civilization had developed. The weather was more variable and potentially more violent. The seasonal patterns were different, with more pronounced changes in temperature and daylight hours. The marine life and ocean conditions were unfamiliar, requiring new knowledge and new techniques for successful navigation and survival. Yet something drew them southward. Perhaps it was the same spirit of exploration that had carried their ancestors across thousands of miles of ocean. Perhaps it was population pressure on their home islands, or the lure of new resources and opportunities. Perhaps it was simply the irresistible challenge of the unknown, the navigator's eternal question of what lay beyond the next horizon. The oral traditions of various Polynesian cultures preserve hints of knowledge about lands to the south. Stories and chants speak of voyages to distant places with different climates and unfamiliar plants and animals. These traditions suggest that the exploration of the Southern Ocean was not a single event, but rather a gradual process of discovery that took place over many generations. The preparation for such a voyage would have been extensive and methodical. The navigators would have gathered every scrap of information available about the southern waters, consulting with any seafarers who might have ventured in that direction, and returned with tales of what they had seen. They would have studied the seasonal patterns of winds and weather, choosing the optimal time for departure when conditions would be most favorable for both the outward journey and a potential return. The selection of crew and passengers would have been crucial. These voyages required not just skilled navigators and experienced sailors, but also the farmers, craftspeople, and cultural leaders who would be needed to establish a successful colony if suitable land were found. Women were essential members of these expeditions, bringing not only their own skills and knowledge, but also the genetic diversity necessary for a founding population. The psychological preparation for such a voyage would have been as important as the physical preparation. Venturing into unknown waters meant leaving behind the familiar world of known islands and predictable conditions. The crew and passengers had to be prepared for the possibility that they might never return home, that they might find themselves committed to life in whatever new land they might discover. The loading of the voyaging canoes would have been a careful balance between necessity and space limitations. Food supplies had to last for weeks or potentially months at sea, including preserved fish, dried fruit, coconut, and other non-perishable items. Fresh water was stored in gourds and bamboo containers, supplemented by the ability to collect rainwater during the voyage. Even more important were the living cargoes that would determine the success of any new settlement. Carefully tended plants including taro, sweet potato, breadfruit, and coconut would provide the foundation for agriculture in a new land. Pigs, dogs, and chickens would supply protein and serve various cultural purposes. These animals and plants represented not just practical necessities, but also connections to home, familiar foods and companions that would ease the psychological challenges of life in an unknown land. The plant materials carried on these voyages represented thousands of years of agricultural development. The varieties of taro, sweet potato, and other crops had been carefully selected and improved over many generations. The breadfruit trees were often represented by small cuttings that would need careful tending to survive the voyage and establish themselves in a new environment. Each plant carried genetic material that represented the accumulated agricultural wisdom of Polynesian civilization. The navigational tools carried on these voyages were few but sophisticated. Star compasses existed not as physical instruments, but as mental constructs, complex systems of knowledge that allowed navigators to maintain their bearings even when clouds obscured the sky for days at a time. Wave pattern charts, constructed from sticks and shells, helped navigators understand the complex interactions of swells and currents around island groups. The stick charts were remarkable devices that encoded complex navigational information in simple materials. Curved sticks represented wave patterns, while shells marked the positions of islands. These charts were not maps in the conventional sense, but rather three-dimensional models that helped navigators visualize and understand the complex interactions of waves and currents around island groups. Each chart represented years of accumulated knowledge about specific regions and sailing conditions. As the great voyaging canoes pushed southward into uncharted waters, the navigators would have noticed subtle changes that told them they were entering a different realm of the ocean. The water itself would have grown cooler. The seasonal patterns of weather would have shifted, and the familiar constellations would have appeared at different angles in the sky. The gradual transition from tropical to temperate waters would have been marked by changes in marine life, water temperature, and weather patterns. The navigators would have observed different species of seabirds, changes in the color and clarity of the water, and shifts in the behavior of waves and currents. Each of these changes would have provided information about their progress and their position relative to the known world they had left behind. The Southern Ocean presented challenges that even these master navigators had rarely encountered. The weather was more variable and potentially more violent than in the tropical Pacific. Storm systems could develop with frightening speed, and the seasonal patterns were different enough from their home waters to require constant adjustment and learning. The westerly winds that dominate the Southern Ocean were stronger and more consistent than anything the navigators had experienced in tropical waters. These winds could drive the voyaging canoes eastward at remarkable speeds, but they also created sea conditions that required new sailing techniques and constant vigilance. The waves generated by these strong winds were larger and more powerful than those of the tropical Pacific, testing both the vessels and the skills of their crews. But these were people who had spent generations learning to read the ocean in all its moods. They understood that the sea was both adversary and ally, a force that demanded respect but would reward those who approached it with proper knowledge and preparation. Their ancestors had faced similar challenges in every stage of their great migration across the Pacific, and they had always found ways to adapt and overcome. The psychological challenges of voyaging in unknown waters were as significant as the physical dangers. The navigators had to maintain confidence and direction without the familiar landmarks and reference points that had guided their ancestors. They had to make decisions based on incomplete information, using their accumulated knowledge and experience to interpret unfamiliar conditions and phenomena. The voyage south would have taken weeks, possibly months, as the navigators felt their way carefully into unknown waters. They would have been constantly alert for signs of land, the behavior of seabirds, changes in wave patterns, the color of the water, the formation of clouds on the horizon. Every day without sight of land would have increased both the tension and the commitment to the voyage, for with each passing day, the point of no return grew closer. The daily routine during such a voyage would have been carefully organized to maintain morale and ensure the safety of all aboard. Navigation duties would have been shared among the most experienced crew members, with constant observation of wind, weather, and sea conditions. The care of plants and animals would have been a constant concern, as their survival was crucial to the success of any potential settlement. Then, somewhere in the vast expanse of the southern Pacific, the signs would have begun to appear. Perhaps it was a change in the color of the water, or the sight of seabirds flying with the purposeful flight of creatures returning to roost. Perhaps it was the distinctive cloud formations that experienced navigators knew indicated the presence of large land masses beyond the horizon. The first signs of land would have been subtle and easily missed by inexperienced eyes. A slight change in wave patterns might indicate the presence of underwater ridges or shelves that suggested nearby land. The behavior of marine life might change, with different species of fish or seabirds appearing in greater numbers. Even the smell of the air might carry hints of vegetation or fresh water that indicated the presence of substantial land masses. The first glimpse of land would have been a moment of triumph and relief, but also of uncertainty. This was clearly a substantial landmass, larger than any island they had previously encountered. The coastline stretched beyond the horizon in both directions, suggesting something more like a continent than an island. The mountains visible in the distance were higher and more dramatic than anything in their island homelands. The scale of what they were seeing would have been almost incomprehensible to people accustomed to small islands. The mountains rising from the sea were taller than any peaks in Polynesia, their snow-capped summits unlike anything in the tropical Pacific. The coastline seemed to extend endlessly in both directions, suggesting a landmass of continental proportions. As they approached the shore, the Polynesian explorers would have seen a land unlike anything in their experience. The forests were different, dominated by species of trees they had never seen before. The beaches and coastlines showed no sign of human habitation, no smoke from cooking fires, no cultivated gardens, no signs of the human presence that marked every habitable island they had ever known. The vegetation they could see from offshore was clearly different from anything in their tropical homelands. The trees were larger and of different species, creating forest canopies that looked dense and impenetrable. The absence of coconut palms, breadfruit trees, and other familiar tropical plants would have been immediately noticeable, raising questions about what food sources might be available in this new land. This was the moment when two worlds collided, when the pristine wilderness of Aotearoa first felt the touch of human feet upon its shores. The exact date remains lost in the mists of time, but most scholars now believe it occurred sometime between 1,000 and 700 years ago, most likely around the year 1250 of the Common Era. The landing itself would have been both cautious and systematic. The navigators would have first explored the coastline to find suitable landing sites, places where the great voyaging canoes could be safely brought ashore and their precious cargoes unloaded. They would have been alert for any signs of danger, any indication that this land might harbor threats unknown in their island homes. The process of landing would have required careful planning and execution. The voyaging canoes, loaded with people, animals, and supplies, would have needed protected harbors or beaches where they could be safely brought ashore. The crew would have scouted potential landing sites, looking for fresh water sources, suitable camping areas, and beaches where the heavy canoes could be hauled up beyond the reach of storms and high tides. What they found instead was a paradise beyond their wildest imaginings, but also a challenge that would test every aspect of their remarkable adaptability. The climate was cooler than their tropical homelands, the seasons more pronounced, the landscape more varied and dramatic. The forests were filled with birds and other creatures they had never seen before, while lacking many of the familiar species that had provided food and materials in Polynesia. The sheer abundance of what they found must have been overwhelming. The forests seemed to stretch endlessly inland, filled with massive trees that dwarfed anything they had known. The rivers were larger and more powerful than any in their island homelands, carrying vast quantities of fresh water from the mountains to the sea. The coastlines were rich with shellfish and other marine resources, while the forests rang with the calls of countless birds. The giant moa that dominated this new landscape must have seemed like creatures from another world. These enormous flightless birds, some standing taller than the tallest human, represented both an opportunity and a mystery. They showed no fear of humans, having never encountered predators of human intelligence and capability. Their size and apparent abundance suggested a rich source of food, but their very existence raised questions about what other surprises this new land might hold. The behavior of the moa would have been unlike anything the Polynesian settlers had ever encountered. These massive birds approached humans with curious fearlessness, having never learned to associate human presence with danger. Their complete lack of wariness would have made them easy prey for experienced hunters. But it would also have been a sobering reminder of how different this new world was from anything they had known. The first settlements would have been established with the careful planning that characterized all Polynesian colonization efforts. Sites would have been chosen for their access to fresh water, their defensibility, their proximity to resources, and their suitability for the crops and animals the settlers had brought with them. The familiar plants and animals from home would have been carefully tended, their survival crucial to the long-term success of the settlement. The establishment of these first settlements required immediate adaptation to local conditions. The shelters built by the settlers had to protect against weather patterns that were different from anything they had experienced in tropical Polynesia. The cooler climate and more variable weather required new approaches to construction and new materials that could provide adequate protection against wind, rain, and cold. But adaptation would have been necessary from the very beginning. The climate of Aotearoa was different enough from tropical Polynesia that many traditional practices would have needed modification. The seasonal rhythms of planting and harvesting, the patterns of weather and wind, the availability of different materials for construction and tool-making all required learning and adjustment. The seasonal changes in this new land would have been more pronounced than anything the settlers had experienced in their tropical homelands. The shorter days of winter, the frost that could kill tender plants, the storms that could arise with little warning, all required new knowledge and new strategies for survival. The settlers had to learn not just how to survive in this new environment, but how to thrive and prosper. The settlers quickly discovered that this new land offered resources unknown in their island homelands. The forest contained trees of enormous size and excellent timber quality. The rivers and lakes teemed with fish, while the coastlines provided shellfish and other marine resources in abundance. The very size of the land meant that resources which were scarce and precious on small islands could be found here in quantities that seemed almost unlimited. The transformation of the landscape began almost immediately, though it would take centuries to fully unfold. The introduction of fire as a land management tool had immediate and dramatic effects. The Polynesian settlers brought with them a sophisticated understanding of how controlled burning could be used to clear land for cultivation, to encourage the growth of useful plants, and to create more favorable conditions for hunting. The use of fire as a landscape management tool was a fundamental part of Polynesian agricultural and hunting practices. The settlers understood how carefully controlled burns could clear undergrowth, encourage the growth of useful plants, and create more open landscapes that were easier to traverse and hunt in. However, The application of these techniques to the dense forests of Aotearoa had effects that were far more dramatic than anything they had experienced in their island homelands. The great forests that had grown undisturbed for millennia suddenly faced a new force of change. Areas of dense bush were opened up by carefully controlled fires, creating grasslands and parklands that were easier to traverse and more suitable for the crops the settlers wanted to grow. The burning also had the unintended effect of creating ideal conditions for the European grasses and other plants that the settlers had brought with them, allowing these introduced species to establish themselves and begin their own transformation of the landscape. The scale of the environmental changes that resulted from human settlement was unprecedented in the history of these islands. Forests that had stood for thousands of years were cleared or modified within decades of human arrival. The introduction of new plants and animals created ecological changes that cascaded through entire ecosystems, affecting everything from soil composition to the behavior of native species. The impact on the native wildlife was immediate and profound. The giant moa, having evolved without any significant predators, were easy prey for skilled hunters armed with spears, snares, and hunting dogs. These magnificent birds, which had ruled the forests for millions of years, found themselves facing extinction within a few centuries of human arrival. The hunting pressure was intense not just because the moa provided large quantities of meat, but also because their bones, feathers, and eggs were valuable for tools, ornaments, and cultural purposes. The hunting of moa became a central part of the early settler economy and culture. These massive birds provided not just food, but materials for tools, clothing, and ceremonial objects. The bones could be carved into fishhooks, needles, and other implements. The feathers were used for ceremonial cloaks and other decorative purposes. Even the eggshells, some large enough to hold several liters of water, became valuable containers and vessels. Other flightless birds faced similar pressures. The taka, the various species of rail, and many other ground-dwelling birds that had evolved in the absence of mammalian predators suddenly found themselves vulnerable to the dogs, rats, and human hunters that had arrived with the Polynesian settlers. The ecological balance that had existed for millions of years was fundamentally altered within just a few generations of human settlement. The introduction of rats, dogs, and other mammals had effects that went far beyond direct predation. These animals competed with native species for food and habitat, while also serving as vectors for diseases and parasites that native species had no resistance to. The rats in particular were devastating to ground, nesting birds and their eggs, while the dogs became efficient hunters that could pursue and kill even relatively large native birds. Yet the settlers themselves were also being transformed by their new environment. The challenges of life in Aotearoa were different from anything their ancestors had faced in tropical Polynesia. The cooler climate, the different seasonal patterns, the unique resources and challenges of this new land all required adaptations that would, over time, create a distinctly new culture. The process of cultural adaptation was gradual but profound. The settlers had to develop new techniques for everything from food preservation to house construction. They had to learn which native plants were edible and how to prepare them. They had to adapt their social and economic systems to the realities of life in a much larger and more varied landscape than any they had known before. The traditional Polynesian crops that had sustained their ancestors for generations had mixed success in this new environment. Taro and breadfruit, staples of tropical Polynesian agriculture, struggled in the cooler climate of Aotearoa. The sweet potato, or kumara, proved more adaptable and became a crucial crop, but even it required careful cultivation and storage techniques to survive the colder winters. The cultivation of kumara in the cooler climate of Aotearoa required innovations in agricultural technique that had not been necessary in tropical Polynesia. The settlers had to develop methods for protecting the plants from frost, extending the growing season, and storing the harvest through the winter months. They learned to build raised beds that would drain better and warm up more quickly in the spring. They developed storage pits that could keep kumara fresh for months, allowing them to survive the winter when fresh food was scarce. The settlers responded to these challenges with the same ingenuity and adaptability that had carried their ancestors across the Pacific. They developed new techniques for food storage and preservation, learning to build elaborate storage pits that could keep kumara and other foods fresh through the winter months. They experimented with new ways of processing and preparing the native plants they found in their new homeland, gradually incorporating native foods like the starchy roots of bracken fern into their diet. The abundance of stone suitable for tool making in Aotearoa opened up new possibilities for technology and craftsmanship. The settlers discovered sources of obsidian, a volcanic glass that could be knapped into blades sharper than any metal, and greenstone, a tough jade, like mineral that could be worked into tools, weapons, and ornaments of extraordinary beauty and durability. These materials were not just useful, but also became central to the developing culture, with greenstone in particular taking on deep spiritual and cultural significance. The working of greenstone required new techniques and tools that the settlers had to develop through experimentation and innovation. This hard, tough stone could not be carved with traditional tools, but required new methods of grinding, drilling, and polishing that took advantage of its unique properties. The finished products were not just functional tools but works of art that became treasured possessions and symbols of status and spiritual power. The social organization of the settlers also began to adapt to their new circumstances. The relatively small founding population, spread across a large and resource-rich landscape, developed social structures that differed in important ways from those of their Polynesian ancestors. The abundance of resources in some areas, and their scarcity in others, led to the development of complex trade networks that connected settlements across the length and breadth of both islands. The development of trade networks was crucial to the success of the early settlements. Different regions of Aotearoa offered different resources and opportunities. The obsidian needed for cutting tools came from specific volcanic areas. The greenstone that became so important culturally was found only in certain river valleys on the South Island. The best timber for canoe building grew in particular forests. These regional specializations created the need for trade relationships that connected distant communities and helped spread innovations and cultural developments across the entire population. The spiritual life of the settlers was also transformed by their encounter with this new land. The landscapes of Aotearoa, with their dramatic mountains, deep lakes, and powerful rivers, inspired new myths and legends that gradually became woven into the cultural fabric of the developing society. The native birds and other creatures became incorporated into spiritual beliefs and practices, while the unique geographical features of the land became sacred sites with their own spiritual significance. The spiritual relationship between the people and their new land developed gradually but profoundly. The dramatic landscapes of Aotearoa, unlike anything in tropical Polynesia, inspired new forms of spiritual expression and new ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world. Mountains, rivers, and forests became not just resources to be used, but spiritual entities with their own mana and their own place in the cosmic order. As generations passed, the descendants of the original Polynesian settlers became increasingly adapted to their new homeland. The skills and knowledge necessary for survival in Aotearoa were passed down and refined, creating a body of traditional knowledge that was specifically suited to the unique conditions of these islands. Hunting techniques developed that were perfectly adapted to the native birds and other creatures. Agricultural practices evolved that made the most of the climate and soils. Building techniques were refined to deal with the different materials and weather conditions. This process of adaptation and innovation continued for centuries, with each generation adding to the accumulated knowledge and skills of their society. The techniques for hunting moa became increasingly sophisticated, involving complex systems of snares, drives, and coordinated group hunts. The methods for working stone and wood evolved to take advantage of the unique materials available in Aotearoa. The agricultural systems became increasingly productive and reliable, allowing the population to grow and spread throughout both islands. The language itself began to change, incorporating new words for the plants, animals, and geographical features that had no equivalent in the tropical Pacific. The very names given to places reflected the unique character of this new homeland, names that described the appearance, the resources, or the spiritual significance of different locations in the developing cultural landscape. The evolution of the language reflected the deep adaptation of the people to their new environment. New words were needed for the snow that capped the mountains, for the different types of forests and grasslands, for the unique birds and other creatures they encountered. The place names that developed during this period often described specific features of the landscape or commemorated important events in the history of particular locations. The artistic traditions of the settlers also evolved in response to their new environment. The native timbers of Aotearoa, particularly the great kori trees, provided carving materials of a quality and size that surpassed anything available in Polynesia. The distinctive artistic styles that would later be recognized as uniquely Maori began to develop during these early centuries, incorporating traditional Polynesian design elements with new motifs inspired by the flora and fauna of Aotearoa. The development of distinctive artistic traditions was a gradual process that reflected both continuity with Polynesian heritage and adaptation to new materials and inspirations. The massive trees available in Aotearoa allowed for carvings of a scale and complexity that had not been possible with the smaller trees of tropical islands. The unique birds and other creatures of the new land provided new motifs and symbols that gradually became incorporated into traditional designs. The social structures of the developing society became increasingly sophisticated as the population grew and spread across the islands. The iwi, or tribal groups, that would later become the fundamental organizing principle of Maori society, began to emerge during this period, each developing its own identity, traditions, and territorial boundaries. These groups were bound together by genealogical connections that traced back to the original voyaging canoes and their crews, creating a social fabric that connected every individual to the founding ancestors and to each other. The development of iwi structure was a response to both the growing population and the need to manage resources across the large and varied landscape of Aotearoa. Each iwi developed its own territory, its own leadership structure, and its own traditions, while maintaining connections to other iwi through marriage, trade, and shared ancestry. This system provided both local identity and broader social cohesion, allowing the society to function effectively across both islands. The concept of mana, the spiritual power and authority that was central to Polynesian society, took on new dimensions in the context of Aotearoa. The dramatic landscapes and unique spiritual qualities of this new homeland provided new sources and expressions of mana, while the challenges of survival and adaptation created new ways for individuals and groups to demonstrate and acquire spiritual authority. In the context of Aotearoa, mana became associated not just with genealogical connections and personal achievements, but also with the ability to successfully adapt to and thrive in this new environment. The knowledge of how to work greenstone, how to hunt moa effectively, how to navigate the complex geography of the islands, all became sources of mana that enhanced the status and authority of those who possessed them. The development of the marae, the ceremonial complexes that would become central to Maori social and spiritual life, began during these early centuries of settlement. These sacred spaces served not just as places of worship and ceremony, but as centers of community life where important decisions were made, disputes were resolved, and cultural knowledge was transmitted from one generation to the next. The marae that developed in Aotearoa reflected both Polynesian traditions and adaptations to the new environment. The meeting houses were built using the superior timber resources available in the new land, while the open ceremonial spaces were designed to accommodate the larger gatherings that were possible with the growing population. These complexes became the focal points of community life, where the social and spiritual fabric of the society was maintained and renewed. The oral traditions that preserved the history, genealogies, and cultural knowledge of the people also began to incorporate the stories and experiences of life in Aotearoa. The great voyages of discovery and settlement became the foundation myths of the new society, while new stories emerged to explain and celebrate the unique features of their homeland. These oral traditions would prove crucial in maintaining cultural continuity and identity as the society continued to evolve and adapt. The development of oral traditions specific to Aotearoa was a crucial part of the cultural adaptation process. The stories of the great voyages that had brought the ancestors to this new land became central to cultural identity. while new myths and legends developed to explain the unique features of the landscape and the relationships between humans and the natural world. These traditions served not just as entertainment, but as repositories of practical knowledge and spiritual wisdom. The technological innovations that emerged during this period reflected both the resources available in Aotearoa and the ingenuity of the settlers in adapting to their new environment. The development of sophisticated techniques for working greenstone created tools and ornaments that were not just functional, but also works of art. The evolution of new hunting techniques and weapons allowed the settlers to make the most of the unique wildlife they encountered. The innovation in tool-making technology was driven by both necessity and opportunity. The abundance of high-quality stone in Aotearoa allowed for the development of tools that were superior to anything available in Polynesia, while the unique challenges of life in the new environment required new types of implements and weapons. The settlers became skilled at working not just greenstone, but also obsidian, argillite, and other stones that were available in different regions. The agricultural systems that developed during this period represented a remarkable adaptation to the climate and conditions of Aotearoa. The Kumara cultivation techniques that evolved included sophisticated methods for extending the growing season, protecting plants from frost, and storing the harvest through the winter months. These innovations were crucial to the survival and prosperity of the developing society. The development of sophisticated agricultural systems was essential to supporting the growing population and ensuring food security through the variable seasons of Aotearoa. The settlers learned to read the subtle signs of weather and season that would determine the success or failure of their crops. They developed storage techniques that could preserve food through the winter months, and they learned to manage the landscape in ways that would maximize the productivity of their agricultural efforts. As the centuries passed, the descendants of the original Polynesian settlers had become something new and distinctive. They were no longer Polynesian islanders adapting to a new environment, but the indigenous people of Aotearoa with their own unique culture, traditions, and identity. The transformation was complete. They had become Maori, the Tangata Whenua, the people of the land. This transformation was not just cultural but also biological, as the population adapted to the new environment over many generations. The people developed immunities to local diseases, adapted to the different diet and climate, and even began to show physical changes that reflected their long residence in this new land. They had become truly indigenous, as much a part of Aotearoa as the native birds and forests. The society that emerged from this long process of adaptation and cultural development was sophisticated, complex, and perfectly adapted to the unique conditions of Aotearoa. The Maori had developed sustainable systems for managing the resources of their homeland, complex social structures that maintained order and provided for the welfare of all members of society, and rich cultural traditions that celebrated their connection to both their Polynesian ancestors and their new homeland. By this time, Maori society had achieved a remarkable balance between human needs and environmental sustainability. The population had grown and spread throughout both islands, but in ways that generally maintained the long-term productivity of the resources upon which they depended. The social systems they had developed provided for both individual fulfillment and collective welfare, while their cultural traditions maintained strong connections to both their ancestral heritage and their adopted homeland. The spiritual relationship between the Maori and their land had become profound and all-encompassing. Every mountain, river, forest, and coastline had its own spiritual significance and its own place in the complex web of relationships that bound the people to their environment. This was not simply a practical relationship based on resource extraction, but a spiritual partnership that recognized the land itself as an ancestor, a living entity with its own mana and its own rights. This spiritual relationship was fundamental to Maori understanding of their place in the world. The land was not property to be owned, but a relative to be cared for and respected. The mountains, rivers, and forests were ancestors whose well-being was essential to the well-being of their human descendants. This understanding shaped every aspect of Maori life, from the ways they harvested resources to the ways they made decisions about the use and management of their territory. The technological achievements of Maori society by this time were remarkable by any standard. The great waka, or war canoes, that they constructed were marvels of engineering and craftsmanship, capable of carrying dozens of warriors across rough seas or along inland waterways. The pia, or fortified settlements, that protected communities during times of conflict, were sophisticated defensive structures that made the most of natural terrain and innovative construction techniques. The waka that were built during this period represented the pinnacle of Polynesian boat building technology, adapted to the unique conditions and resources of Aotearoa. These vessels were larger and more sophisticated than anything built in tropical Polynesia, taking advantage of the massive trees available in the new land to create canoes of unprecedented size and capability. The largest waka could carry over 100 warriors, while smaller vessels served for fishing, transportation, and everyday travel. The artistic traditions of the Maori had reached extraordinary levels of sophistication and beauty. The intricate wood carvings that decorated meeting houses and other important buildings were not just decorative, but also served as historical records, genealogical charts, and spiritual focal points. The distinctive spiral and curved motifs that characterized Maori art had become a visual language that could communicate complex cultural and spiritual concepts. The artistic achievements of this period reflected both the superior materials available in Aotearoa and the cultural sophistication that had developed over centuries of adaptation and innovation. The carvings that decorated meeting houses told the stories of ancestors and historical events, while also serving as focal points for spiritual and cultural activities. The distinctive artistic style that had emerged was unlike anything else in the Pacific, reflecting the unique cultural synthesis that had occurred in Aotearoa. The social organization of Maori society had evolved into a complex system that balanced individual rights with collective responsibilities, maintained order without stifling innovation, and provided for the welfare of all members of society while recognizing differences in status and authority. The concepts of wakapapa, or genealogical connection, and manaakatanga, or hospitality and care for others, had become fundamental organizing principles that shaped every aspect of social interaction. The social systems that had evolved were sophisticated and effective, providing both stability and flexibility. The iwi and hap structure allowed for both local autonomy and broader cooperation, while the concepts of mana and tapu provided frameworks for understanding and managing social relationships. The emphasis on genealogical connections ensured that every individual had a place in the social fabric, while the values of manaakatanga ensured that the welfare of all members of the community was protected. The oral traditions of the Maori had become a vast repository of cultural knowledge that preserved not just historical information, but also practical knowledge about everything from navigation and agriculture to medicine and spiritual practices. These traditions were maintained by specialists who dedicated their lives to memorizing and transmitting this crucial cultural heritage, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancestors would be available to guide future generations. The oral traditions that had developed were remarkable for both their scope and their accuracy. These traditions preserved detailed genealogies that could trace family connections back to the original voyaging canoes, historical accounts of important events and migrations, and practical knowledge about everything from weather patterns to medicinal plants. The specialists who maintained these traditions were highly trained and respected members of society, whose knowledge was essential to the functioning of their communities. By the time several centuries had passed since the first Polynesian voyagers had landed on the shores of Aotearoa, their descendants had created one of the most sophisticated indigenous societies in the Pacific. They had successfully adapted to a challenging new environment while maintaining their cultural identity and spiritual connections to their ancestors. They had developed sustainable relationships with their environment that allowed them to prosper without destroying the resources upon which their prosperity depended. The achievements of Maori society by this time were remarkable by any measure. They had developed complex social and political systems that maintained order and provided for the welfare of all members of society. They had created artistic and cultural traditions of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. They had developed technologies and techniques that were perfectly adapted to their environment and resources. Most importantly, they had maintained strong spiritual connections to both their ancestral heritage and their adopted homeland. The Maori had become the Tangata Wenua, the people of the land, with a deep and abiding connection to Aotearoa that went far beyond simple occupation or ownership. They were part of the land and the land was part of them, bound together by spiritual ties that had been forged through centuries of shared experience and mutual adaptation. This relationship between people and land was fundamental to Maori identity and worldview. It shaped their understanding of themselves, their responsibilities, and their place in the world. The land was not just their home, but their ancestor, their spiritual foundation, and their inheritance for future generations. This understanding would prove crucial in the challenges that lay ahead. This was the society that would soon face its greatest challenge, as strange vessels appeared on the horizon carrying people from a world so different from their own that the very concepts of land ownership, individual property, and centralized government would seem as alien to the Maori as their own spiritual relationship with the land would seem to the newcomers. The stage was set for an encounter between two worlds that would transform both forever, an encounter that would test everything the Maori had learned about adaptation, survival, and the maintenance of cultural identity in the face of unprecedented change. The year 1770 marked a turning point in the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Though neither the Maori inhabitants nor the strange visitors who appeared on their shores could have fully comprehended the magnitude of change that was about to unfold. On the 6th of October, the people of Poverty Bay witnessed something unprecedented in their collective memory, a sight that would be remembered and retold for generations to come. 3 massive vessels, unlike anything in their experience, appeared on the eastern horizon, their white sails billowing in the Pacific winds like enormous bird wings against the blue sky. The morning had begun like countless others before it, with the rhythmic sounds of waves breaking against the shore and the familiar calls of seabirds wheeling overhead. Children played along the water's edge while their elders attended to the daily tasks that sustained their communities. Fishermen prepared their nets and lines, women tended gardens of kumara and other precious crops, and craftsmen worked on the intricate carvings and weavings that expressed their cultural identity and spiritual beliefs. The seasonal patterns that had governed Maori life for centuries continued their ancient rhythm, unmarked by any sense of the momentous encounter that was approaching from across the vast Pacific Ocean. These were not the familiar waka of neighboring iwi, nor were they the vessels of any known people from across the great ocean. The ships were enormous, far larger than any craft the Maori had ever constructed, and they moved with a purpose and direction that suggested their occupants possessed knowledge of navigation that differed fundamentally from traditional Polynesian wayfinding techniques. The largest of these vessels was the Endeavour, commanded by Captain James Cook of the British Royal Navy, a man whose mission would forever alter the trajectory of New Zealand's history. Cook himself was a remarkable figure, born into humble circumstances in Yorkshire and rising through the ranks of the Royal Navy through exceptional skill, determination, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. His previous voyages had established his reputation as one of Britain's most capable navigators and cartographers, qualities that made him the ideal choice for a mission that combined scientific observation with geographical exploration and imperial expansion. The man who would become the first European to set foot on New Zealand soil was driven by a complex mixture of professional ambition, scientific curiosity, and loyalty to the British Crown that would shape every aspect of his interactions with the indigenous peoples he encountered. Cook had been dispatched by the British Admiralty on what was officially described as a scientific expedition to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti. But his sealed orders contained additional instructions of far greater historical significance. He was to search for the great southern continent that European geographers believed must exist to balance the landmasses of the northern hemisphere, and to chart and claim any lands he might discover in the name of King George III of Great Britain. These secret instructions reflected the complex geopolitical rivalries of 18th century Europe, where national prestige and commercial advantage were increasingly dependent on the acquisition of overseas territories and the establishment of global trading networks. The scientific mission that provided the official justification for Cook's voyage was itself part of an international effort to advance human understanding of astronomy and navigation. The transit of Venus across the face of the Sun was a rare astronomical event that could provide crucial data for calculating the distance between Earth and the Sun, information that would improve navigation and enhance European maritime capabilities. The fact that this scientific mission was combined with territorial exploration and imperial expansion reflected the close relationship between scientific knowledge and political power in the age of European expansion. The encounter that followed would become one of the most documented and analyzed first meetings between European explorers and indigenous peoples in the Pacific. Yet it would also establish patterns of misunderstanding, conflict, and cultural collision that would define European Maori relations for decades to come. The Maori of Poverty Bay, led by chiefs whose names would be recorded in Cook's journals, approached these strange visitors with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and traditional protocols for receiving strangers. The initial sighting of the European ships created intense discussion and debate within Maori communities along the coast. Runners carried news of the strange vessels from settlement to settlement, and tribal leaders convened to consider the appropriate response to these unprecedented visitors. Some argued for caution, suggesting that the strangers might pose a threat to local communities and resources. Others advocated for a more welcoming approach, seeing potential opportunities for trade, alliance, or the acquisition of new knowledge and technologies. The debates that took place in those crucial hours reflected the sophisticated political processes that governed Maori decision-making and the careful consideration that tribal leaders gave to matters affecting their people's welfare and security. In Maori culture, the arrival of visitors triggered well-established procedures designed to determine whether newcomers came in peace or war, whether they were potential allies or enemies, and what their intentions might be regarding the local people and their resources. The traditional Piwari or welcome ceremony involved formal challenges, speeches, and exchanges of gifts that would establish the status and relationships between hosts and guests. These protocols had evolved over centuries to manage interactions between different tribal groups and to provide frameworks for peaceful coexistence and mutual benefit. However, the Europeans aboard Cook's vessels had no understanding of these protocols and interpreted Maori actions through the lens of their own cultural assumptions about primitive peoples and savage behavior. The complexity of Maori social protocols reflected a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and group dynamics that enabled different communities to interact safely and productively despite potential conflicts over resources, territory, or prestige. The formal challenges that were part of traditional welcome ceremonies served multiple purposes, allowing hosts to assess the intentions and capabilities of visitors while providing opportunities for both sides to demonstrate their strength, dignity, and cultural sophistication. The speeches that accompanied these ceremonies conveyed important information about genealogies, territorial boundaries, and mutual obligations, while the exchange of gifts established reciprocal relationships that could form the basis for ongoing cooperation and alliance. The first encounters were marked by tragic misunderstandings that would set the tone for much of what followed. When Maori warriors performed the traditional haka challenge, the Europeans interpreted this as an aggressive act rather than a formal protocol for determining the visitor's intentions. The powerful rhythmic chanting, synchronized movements, and fierce facial expressions that characterized the haka were designed to demonstrate the strength and unity of the local community while providing an opportunity for visitors to respond with their own displays of peaceful or hostile intent. However, Cook's men saw only what appeared to be a threatening display of savage aggression that required an immediate and decisive response. When Cook's men fired muskets over the heads of the Maori to demonstrate their superior firepower, they believed they were establishing their authority and deterring attack. Instead, they were violating fundamental principles of Maori hospitality and diplomacy, creating an atmosphere of fear and hostility that made genuine communication almost impossible. The thunderous sound of gunpowder weapons, completely unknown in traditional Maori experience, created panic and confusion that overwhelmed the careful protocols that might have enabled peaceful first contact. The Europeans' resort to displays of force as a means of establishing dominance contradicted Maori expectations that visitors would engage in formal dialogue and negotiation to establish their status and intentions. The technological disparity between the two cultures was immediately apparent and would become a defining factor in all subsequent interactions. The Maori possessed sophisticated technologies perfectly adapted to their environment and needs, but they had no experience with metal tools, firearms, or the complex sailing vessels that had brought the Europeans across the vast Pacific Ocean. The sight of iron nails, steel knives, and woolen cloth must have seemed as miraculous to the Maori as their intricate jade carvings, feather cloaks, and masterful wood sculptures appeared exotic to the Europeans. Maori technology represented the culmination of centuries of innovation and adaptation to the unique conditions of New Zealand's environment. Their tools and weapons, crafted from stone, bone, and wood, demonstrated remarkable sophistication in design and manufacture, while their agricultural techniques had transformed the landscape through careful cultivation of crops imported from tropical Polynesia and adapted to New Zealand's temperate climate. The construction of elaborate fortifications, known as pa, showed advanced understanding of military engineering and defensive strategy, while their ocean-going waka demonstrated mastery of maritime technology that had enabled their ancestors to navigate thousands of miles of open ocean to reach New Zealand in the first place. European technology, by contrast, represented the accumulated innovations of societies that had developed complex metallurgy, gunpowder weapons, and ocean-going sailing ships through centuries of warfare, trade, and scientific advancement. The Europeans' ability to cross vast ocean distances with large quantities of supplies and equipment gave them enormous advantages in any extended conflict, while their metal tools and weapons provided immediate tactical superiority in most situations. However, European technology was also dependent on complex supply chains and manufacturing processes that could not be easily replicated in New Zealand's isolated environment. Cook's journals provide detailed observations of Maori society, technology, and customs, though they are inevitably filtered through 18th-century European assumptions about civilization, progress, and human development. He noted the sophistication of Maori fortifications, which he correctly identified as being designed for warfare between groups possessing similar weapons and tactics. He observed their agricultural practices, commenting on the careful cultivation of kumara and other crops, and he recorded his impressions of Maori's social organization, though he failed to grasp the complexity of iwi and hapu relationships. Cook's descriptions of Maori society reveal both his genuine curiosity about the people he encountered and the limitations of his cultural perspective. He was particularly impressed by Maori physical appearance and bearing, describing them as tall, well-proportioned, and dignified in their manner and deportment. He noted their elaborate tattoos, which he recognized as markers of social status and cultural identity, though he could not fully understand their deeper spiritual and genealogical significance. His observations of Maori clothing, ornaments, and personal decoration provided valuable ethnographic information, though his interpretations were inevitably influenced by European standards of beauty, propriety, and social organization. The Europeans were particularly impressed by Maori craftsmanship, especially their skill in working wood and stone without metal tools. Cook's naturalist Joseph Banks collected numerous examples of Maori material culture, including weapons, tools, ornaments, and clothing, creating one of the first systematic European collections of New Zealand artifacts. These items would eventually find their way to British museums, where they would shape European understanding of Maori culture for generations. Banks, as the expedition's chief naturalist, brought scientific training and intellectual curiosity that complemented Cook's navigational and military expertise. His detailed observations of New Zealand's flora, fauna, and indigenous peoples provided the foundation for European scientific understanding of the country's natural and cultural environment. His collections of plant specimens, animal samples, and cultural artifacts created an invaluable record of New Zealand's biodiversity and Maori material culture at the time of first European contact. However, his scientific approach was also shaped by European assumptions about the relationship between civilization and nature, leading him to interpret Maori society as representing an earlier stage of human development, rather than a different, but equally valid approach to organizing social and economic life. However, the Europeans' attempts to understand Maori society were severely limited by their own cultural assumptions and by the brief nature of their encounters. They interpreted what they saw through the lens of European social hierarchies, economic systems, and political structures, often misunderstanding fundamental aspects of Maori organization and values. The concept of collective land ownership, for example, was completely foreign to Europeans accustomed to individual property rights and market-based land transactions. European observers struggled to comprehend the complex relationships between individuals, families, hapu, and iwi that governed Maori social organization. They looked for kings, nobles, and peasants comparable to European social hierarchies, but found instead a more fluid system of leadership based on genealogy, personal achievement, and spiritual authority that did not conform to their expectations. Maori concepts of mana and tapu, which governed relationships between people and between humans and the natural world, were particularly difficult for Europeans to understand, as they had no equivalent concepts in their own cultural vocabulary. The European emphasis on individual achievement and competition conflicted with Maori values that emphasized collective responsibility and mutual obligation. Where Europeans saw inefficiency and lack of ambition, Maori saw wisdom and social harmony. Where Maori saw spiritual relationships and ancestral obligations, Europeans saw superstition and primitive thinking. These fundamental differences in worldview would create ongoing misunderstandings and conflicts that would persist long after the initial period of contact. Cook's expedition circumnavigated both islands of New Zealand, creating the first accurate European maps of the coastline and establishing place names that would endure alongside traditional Maori names. His charts would guide subsequent European visitors and would eventually facilitate the colonization process. Though Cook himself had no way of knowing the long-term consequences of his mapping activities, he claimed the entire country for Great Britain, performing the formal ceremonies required by European international law, though he had no authority from Maori leaders to make such claims and no understanding of Maori concepts of sovereignty or territorial rights. The process of mapping and naming represented a form of symbolic possession that preceded and enabled physical occupation. By creating European names for geographical features and recording them on official charts, Cook was effectively translating the New Zealand landscape into European conceptual frameworks that would guide future European understanding and use of the territory. The fact that these European names were imposed without consultation with Maori communities or consideration of existing Maori place names reflected European assumptions about their right to claim and rename territories they encountered. Cook's formal claims of sovereignty over New Zealand followed established European legal procedures for claiming uninhabited or unorganized territories, but these procedures assumed that indigenous peoples either did not exist or did not possess legitimate political authority over their territories. The ceremonies of possession that Cook performed were meaningful within European international law, but they had no validity within Maori legal and political systems, creating conflicting claims of authority that would eventually lead to serious political and legal disputes. The immediate impact of Cook's visits was relatively limited, but the long-term consequences would prove revolutionary. His published accounts of New Zealand and its people would attract the attention of traders, missionaries, and eventually settlers who saw opportunities for profit, conversion, and colonization. The detailed information he provided about New Zealand's geography, climate, and resources would inform British colonial policy and would influence decisions about the strategic importance of New Zealand in the expanding British Empire. Cook's journals and the official accounts of his voyages became bestsellers in Europe, feeding popular fascination with exotic lands and peoples while providing practical information for potential investors, settlers, and government officials. His descriptions of New Zealand's fertile soil, temperate climate, and abundant natural resources painted a picture of a land ideally suited for European settlement and economic development. His accounts of Maori society, while respectful in tone, reinforced European assumptions about the superiority of European civilization and the potential for improving primitive societies through contact with European religion, education, and technology. The strategic implications of Cook's discoveries were not lost on British naval and political leaders, who recognized that New Zealand's location in the South Pacific could provide important advantages in future conflicts with other European powers. The country's harbors could serve as bases for British naval operations, while its resources could support British shipping and trade throughout the Pacific region. These strategic considerations would become increasingly important as European rivalry extended into the Pacific and as Britain sought to maintain its naval supremacy against French and other challenges. More immediately, Cook's encounters established patterns of European Maori interaction that would persist for decades. Europeans tended to approach Maori society with preconceived notions about primitive peoples and savage customs, while Maori attempted to incorporate these strange visitors into their existing frameworks for understanding strangers and managing inter-group relationships. Neither side fully understood the other's intentions, values, or social systems, creating a foundation for misunderstanding that would complicate all future interactions. The cultural frameworks that each group brought to their encounters were products of centuries of historical development and reflected fundamentally different approaches to organizing social life. Understanding the natural world and managing relationships between different communities, Europeans brought assumptions about progress, civilization, and individual rights that were rooted in their experience of social change, technological development, and political evolution in Europe. Maori brought assumptions about kinship, reciprocity, and spiritual relationships that were rooted in their experience of life in small-scale communities closely connected to the natural environment. These different cultural frameworks created different expectations about how interactions between strangers should be conducted and what outcomes such interactions should produce. Europeans expected to establish clear hierarchies of authority and to negotiate formal agreements that would define future relationships according to European legal and commercial principles. Maori expected to establish kinship, like relationships that would create ongoing obligations and opportunities for mutual support according to traditional principles of reciprocity and collective responsibility. The technological advantages possessed by Europeans became immediately apparent and would fundamentally alter the balance of power in New Zealand society. Maori quickly recognized the superior effectiveness of metal tools and weapons, and they began to seek opportunities to acquire these items through trade or other means. This created new forms of dependency and competition that would gradually undermine traditional economic and social relationships within Maori society. The introduction of European technology created what anthropologists call a demonstration effect, in which the obvious superiority of certain European tools and techniques created immediate demand for access to European goods and knowledge. Metal axes could fell trees in a fraction of the time required by traditional stone tools, while metal fish hooks and knives provided significant advantages in food production and preparation. European textiles offered new possibilities for clothing and decoration, while European weapons provided decisive advantages in warfare between different Maori groups. However, access to European technology was limited and uneven, creating new forms of inequality within and between Maori communities. Groups that had direct contact with European traders could acquire metal tools and weapons, while more isolated communities remained dependent on traditional technologies. This technological disparity began to alter traditional relationships between different iwi and hapu, as groups with access to European weapons gained military advantages over their neighbors. The resulting arms race contributed to an escalation of warfare that would have devastating consequences for Maori society over the following decades. Cook's voyages also introduced Maori to European diseases, though the full impact of this biological exchange would not become apparent for several decades. The isolation that had protected New Zealand from many of the infectious diseases common in other parts of the world had also left Maori populations without immunity to smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses that Europeans carried as a matter of course. The demographic consequences of this disease exchange would prove as significant as any other aspect of European contact. The biological impact of European contact represented what historians call a virgin soil epidemic, in which populations with no previous exposure to certain diseases experienced catastrophic mortality rates when those diseases were introduced. Similar patterns had occurred throughout the Americas following European contact, and they would be repeated in many Pacific Island societies as European exploration and settlement expanded throughout the region. The fact that Europeans themselves were often unaware of their role as disease carriers made this biological exchange particularly tragic and unpredictable. The diseases introduced by European contact would eventually cause massive population decline among Maori communities, though the full extent of this demographic disaster would not become apparent until well into the 19th century. Some estimates suggest that Maori population may have declined by as much as 50% or more between first European contact and the mid-1800s, though the exact figures remain disputed among historians and demographers. This population decline would have profound social, cultural, and political consequences, weakening Maori communities' ability to resist European encroachment and maintain traditional ways of life. The period following Cook's initial contact saw a gradual increase in European interest in New Zealand, though large-scale immigration would not begin for several decades. The first Europeans to establish ongoing relationships with Maori communities were typically traders, whalers, and escaped convicts from the Australian penal colonies who found refuge among Maori communities willing to accept them. These early European residents often adopted Maori customs and lifestyles, marrying into local communities and serving as intermediaries between Maori and later European arrivals. The whalers who began visiting New Zealand waters in increasing numbers during the late 18th and early 19th centuries represented the first significant group of Europeans to establish regular contact with Maori communities. The whaling industry required shore-based support for ship repairs, fresh water, and food supplies, creating opportunities for mutually beneficial trade relationships between European whalers and coastal Maori communities. These interactions introduced Maori to European manufactured goods, including metal tools, weapons, textiles, and alcohol, while providing Europeans with fresh food, water, and local knowledge. The escaped convicts who found refuge in Maori communities represented a different type of early European resident, men who had fled the harsh conditions of the Australian penal colonies and sought sanctuary among indigenous peoples who might provide protection from colonial authorities. Some of these men integrated successfully into Maori society, learning the language and customs and contributing their European knowledge and skills to their adopted communities. Others remained marginal figures who exploited their position as cultural intermediaries for personal advantage. These early European residents played crucial roles in facilitating communication and trade between the two cultures, though their influence was not always positive. Some used their knowledge of both cultures to exploit Maori communities or to facilitate unfair trading relationships that benefited Europeans at Maori expense. Others genuinely integrated into Maori society and served as advocates for Maori interests in dealings with later European arrivals. The cultural brokers who emerged from these early contact situations possessed unique knowledge and skills that made them valuable to both European and Maori communities. Their ability to speak both languages and understand both cultural systems enabled them to facilitate trade negotiations, resolve disputes, and provide information that helped both sides navigate the complexities of cross-cultural interaction. However, their intermediate position also made them potentially unreliable allies for either side, as their loyalties were often divided and their interests did not always align with those of the communities they served. The whaling industry became one of the first significant points of ongoing contact between Europeans and Maori, as whaling ships required fresh water, food, and repairs that could be obtained from coastal Maori communities. These interactions created new economic opportunities for Maori, who could trade traditional foods, fresh water, and labor for European manufactured goods. However, they also introduced Maori to European alcohol, which would become a significant social problem in many communities. The whaling stations that were established at various points around the New Zealand coast became focal points for European Maori interaction and cultural exchange. These facilities required significant cooperation between European whalers and local Maori communities, as the Europeans needed access to land, water, and labor, while Maori communities could benefit from trade opportunities and access to European goods and technologies. The relationships that developed around these whaling stations were often complex and sometimes troubled, as cultural differences and competing interests created ongoing tensions and conflicts. The introduction of alcohol into Maori communities through contact with whalers and other European visitors created serious social problems that would persist for generations. Maori had no cultural traditions for managing alcohol consumption, and many individuals and communities struggled with the destructive effects of excessive drinking. The availability of alcohol also created new forms of exploitation, as unscrupulous traders could use alcohol to manipulate Maori decision-making in land sales and other important transactions. The arrival of Christian missionaries in the early 19th century marked the beginning of a new phase in European Maori relations, one that would have profound and lasting consequences for Maori culture, society, and spiritual beliefs. The first missionary to establish a permanent presence in New Zealand was Samuel Marston, an Anglican chaplain from New South Wales who arrived in the Bay of Islands in 1814 with the explicit goal of converting Maori to Christianity and introducing them to European civilization. Marston represented a different type of European visitor than the traders and whalers who had dominated earlier contact. Where the earlier visitors had been primarily interested in economic gain and had been willing to adapt to Maori customs and expectations in order to facilitate trade, Marston came with an explicit religious and cultural mission that required fundamental changes in Maori beliefs and practices. His arrival marked the beginning of systematic European efforts to transform Maori society according to European Christian models of civilization and moral development. The missionary movement that Marston represented was part of a broader evangelical revival that was transforming British religious and social life in the early 19th century. This movement combined intense personal religious conviction with social reform activism and imperial expansion, creating a powerful force for cultural transformation throughout the British Empire. The missionaries who came to New Zealand brought not only Christian religious beliefs, but also European ideas about education, family life, economic organization, and political authority that would challenge every aspect of traditional Maori society. Marston and the missionaries who followed him brought a fundamentally different approach to European Maori relations than had characterized earlier contacts with traders and whalers. Where earlier Europeans had generally been content to engage with Maori on Maori terms, accepting local customs and adapting to local conditions, the missionaries came with an explicit agenda to transform Maori society according to European Christian models of civilization and progress. The missionary approach was based on the assumption that Maori culture and traditional beliefs were not merely different from European norms, but were actually inferior and needed to be replaced with superior European alternatives. This represented a fundamental challenge to Maori identity and worldview that went far beyond the technological and economic changes that had resulted from earlier European contacts. The missionaries sought to change not just what Maori did, but who they were and how they understood themselves and their relationship to the world. The missionary critique of Maori society was comprehensive and systematic, targeting not only religious beliefs and practices but also social customs, family structures, economic activities, and political organization. Missionaries condemned traditional Maori spiritual beliefs as heathen superstition, criticized polygamy and other marriage customs as immoral, and attacked traditional forms of leadership and decision-making as primitive and inefficient. Their goal was nothing less than the complete transformation of Maori society according to European Christian principles of individual salvation, nuclear family organization, and capitalist economic development. Initially, missionary efforts met with limited success, as Maori leaders were generally suspicious of European attempts to interfere with traditional beliefs and practices. However, some Maori communities began to see potential advantages in associating with missionaries, particularly the access to European education, technology, and trade goods that such associations could provide. The missionaries also offered protection from the increasingly disruptive effects of European contact, including the violence and social problems associated with the musket wars that were devastating many Maori communities. The gradual acceptance of missionary influence in some Maori communities reflected pragmatic calculations about the benefits and costs of association with these particular Europeans. Missionary stations could provide access to European goods and technologies without the social problems associated with whaling stations and trading posts. Missionary education could provide Maori children with valuable knowledge of European language and customs that might be useful in future dealings with Europeans. Missionary protection could offer some security against the violence and disruption that was spreading throughout the country as a result of European contact. The Musket Wars represented one of the most tragic consequences of early European contact, as the introduction of firearms fundamentally altered the nature of traditional Maori warfare and created unprecedented levels of destruction and social disruption. Maori communities that gained early access to muskets through trade with Europeans found themselves with overwhelming military advantages over their traditional enemies, leading to a cycle of conquest and retaliation that spread throughout the country. The traditional warfare that had existed between Maori communities before European contact had been limited by the technology available and by cultural constraints that prevented total destruction of enemy communities. Traditional weapons required close combat and considerable skill to use effectively, while cultural values emphasized the capture of prisoners and the acquisition of prestige rather than the complete annihilation of enemies. The introduction of firearms changed these dynamics completely, making it possible for small numbers of warriors to inflict massive casualties on much larger forces and creating incentives for total warfare that had not existed in traditional Maori society. These conflicts were not simply traditional wars fought with new weapons, but represented a fundamental transformation of Maori society under the pressure of European contact. The scale of destruction was unprecedented in Maori history, with some estimates suggesting that the Musket Wars resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of people and the displacement of entire communities. The social and psychological trauma of this period would have lasting effects on Maori society and would influence Maori attitudes toward Europeans and European authority for generations. The Musket Wars created a vicious cycle of violence and retaliation that spread throughout the country as different iwi and hapu sought to acquire firearms to defend themselves against enemies who had already obtained them. Communities that had lived in relative peace for generations found themselves drawn into conflicts that threatened their very survival. The traditional balance of power between different regions and tribal groups was completely disrupted, creating new patterns of dominance and subordination that bore little relationship to traditional political arrangements. The social disruption caused by the Musket Wars extended far beyond the immediate casualties of warfare. Entire communities were forced to abandon their traditional territories and seek refuge in unfamiliar areas, disrupting agricultural cycles and undermining the local knowledge that sustained traditional economic activities. The constant threat of attack made it difficult to maintain normal social and cultural activities, while the focus on military preparation diverted resources and attention from other important community needs. The missionaries positioned themselves as alternatives to the destructive influences of traders and whalers, offering Maori communities a different model of European civilization based on Christian values of peace, education, and moral improvement. Some Maori leaders began to see Christianity as a potential solution to the social problems that had resulted from European contact, and they welcomed missionary efforts to establish schools, medical services, and new forms of economic development. The missionary promise of peace and stability had particular appeal to Maori communities that had been devastated by the Musket Wars and were seeking alternatives to the cycle of violence and retaliation that was destroying their society. Christian teachings about forgiveness, reconciliation, and peaceful conflict resolution offered hope for communities that had been trapped in seemingly endless cycles of warfare and revenge. The missionary emphasis on education and moral improvement also appealed to Maori leaders who recognized that their people needed new knowledge and skills to survive in a world increasingly dominated by European influence. However, the missionary alternative came with its own costs and requirements that many Maori found difficult to accept. Conversion to Christianity required abandoning traditional spiritual beliefs and practices that were central to Maori identity and cultural continuity. Missionary education emphasized European knowledge and values while devaluing traditional Maori knowledge and learning. Missionary economic development programs promoted European forms of agriculture and trade while discouraging traditional economic activities and relationships. The process of Christian conversion was complex and varied significantly from community to community. Some Maori embraced Christianity enthusiastically, seeing it as a source of new spiritual power and practical advantages. Others remained deeply suspicious of missionary motives and resisted efforts to undermine traditional beliefs and practices. Many Maori attempted to combine Christian and traditional elements, creating syncretic forms of belief and practice that satisfied their spiritual needs while maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. The Maori who became Christian converts often did so for complex reasons that went beyond simple religious conviction. Some saw Christianity as a source of spiritual power that could supplement or replace traditional sources of mana and spiritual protection. Others were attracted by the practical advantages that conversion could provide, including access to European education, trade goods, and political protection. Still others were influenced by family members or community leaders who had decided that Christianity offered the best hope for survival in a rapidly changing world. The missionaries' efforts to create written forms of Maori language represented one of their most significant and lasting contributions to Maori culture. Prior to European contact, Maori had maintained their cultural traditions through oral transmission, with elaborate systems of storytelling, genealogical recitation, and ceremonial performance that preserved historical knowledge and cultural values across generations. The development of written Maori allowed for new forms of cultural preservation and transmission, though it also began to alter the nature of Maori oral traditions. The creation of a written form of Maori language required extensive collaboration between missionaries and Maori experts who could provide detailed knowledge of pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. This collaborative process created opportunities for cultural exchange and mutual learning that went beyond the missionaries' primary goal of religious conversion. Maori participants in these language projects gained valuable knowledge of European literacy and printing technologies, while missionaries developed deeper understanding of Maori culture and thought processes. The translation of Christian texts into Maori, particularly the Bible, required missionaries to develop deep understanding of Maori language and concepts, though their translations inevitably reflected European theological assumptions and cultural biases. The process of translation also required Maori collaborators who could bridge the gap between European and Maori understanding, creating new forms of intellectual and cultural exchange that would influence both communities. The challenges involved in translating Christian concepts into Maori revealed fundamental differences between European and Maori worldviews that went far beyond simple linguistic differences. Christian concepts of sin, salvation, and divine authority had no direct equivalence in traditional Maori thought, requiring translators to create new vocabulary and conceptual frameworks that could convey European religious ideas in ways that Maori audiences could understand. The resulting translations inevitably involved compromises and adaptations that altered both Christian and Maori concepts in subtle but significant ways. By the 1830s, the cumulative effects of several decades of European contact were becoming apparent throughout New Zealand. A Maori society had been fundamentally transformed by the introduction of new technologies, new economic relationships, new diseases, and new ideas about religion, education, and social organization. Traditional patterns of leadership, kinship, and territorial control had been disrupted by the Musket Wars and by the new opportunities and challenges created by European presence. The changes that had occurred in Maori society by this time were both profound and uneven, affecting different communities in different ways depending on their location, their contact with Europeans, and their ability to adapt to new circumstances. Some communities had been devastated by warfare and disease, while others had prospered through trade and alliance with Europeans. Some had embraced Christianity and European education, while others had maintained traditional beliefs and practices. The diversity of Maori responses to European contact reflected the complexity of Maori society and the different challenges and opportunities that different communities faced. At the same time, increasing numbers of Europeans were arriving in New Zealand, drawn by reports of economic opportunities, available land, and the potential for profitable trade with Maori communities. These new arrivals included not just missionaries and traders, but also settlers seeking to establish permanent communities and to acquire land for farming and other economic activities. The nature of European Maori relations was beginning to shift from occasional contact and trade to ongoing coexistence and competition for resources. The European settlers who began arriving in increasing numbers during the 1830s brought different expectations and requirements than the traders, whalers, and missionaries who had dominated earlier European contact. Where earlier Europeans had been content to work within existing Maori social and political frameworks, the settlers needed secure access to land, reliable legal protections for their property and investments, and political institutions that could provide the stability and predictability required for permanent settlement and economic development. The question of land ownership became increasingly contentious as European settlement expanded. Europeans operated according to legal and economic systems that treated land as a commodity that could be bought, sold, and owned by individuals, while Maori understood land in terms of collective tribal ownership and spiritual relationships that could not be transferred through simple commercial transactions. These fundamentally different concepts of land ownership would become the source of ongoing conflict and misunderstanding. The European concept of individual land ownership was based on centuries of legal and economic development that had created complex systems of property rights, commercial law, and market-based resource allocation. These systems assumed that land was primarily an economic resource that could be bought and sold like any other commodity, and that individual ownership provided the most efficient means of organizing agricultural production and economic development. European settlers brought these assumptions with them to New Zealand and expected to be able to acquire land through straightforward purchase agreements that would provide clear and secure title to their property. Maori concepts of land ownership were based on entirely different principles that emphasized collective tribal ownership, ancestral connections, and spiritual relationships between people and land. In traditional Maori society, land belonged to the iwi or hapu as a whole, and decisions about land use required consensus among tribal members and consideration of the interests of future generations. Land was not simply an economic resource, but was intimately connected to tribal identity, spiritual beliefs, and cultural practices that could not be separated from the physical territory itself. European settlers also brought different assumptions about government, law, and social order that conflicted with traditional Maori systems of tribal authority and customary law. As European communities grew larger and more permanent, they began to demand the establishment of European-style legal and political institutions that would protect their interests and property rights. However, such institutions would necessarily challenge traditional Maori authority and autonomy. The European settlers' demands for familiar legal and political institutions reflected their need for predictable and enforceable rules governing property rights, commercial transactions, and social relationships. The informal arrangements that had characterized earlier European Maori interactions were inadequate for the more complex and permanent relationships that European settlement required. Settlers needed courts that could enforce contracts and resolve disputes, police forces that could maintain order and protect property, and governments that could provide public services and regulate economic development. However, the establishment of European legal and political institutions in New Zealand would necessarily involve the assertion of European sovereignty over territories that Maori considered to be under their own authority. This created a fundamental conflict between European and Maori concepts of political authority that could not be resolved through simple negotiation or compromise. The question of who had the right to make and enforce laws in New Zealand would become one of the central issues in European and Maori relations over the following decades. The British government was becoming increasingly concerned about the situation in New Zealand as reports of lawlessness, conflict, and exploitation reached London through official and unofficial channels. There were growing calls for the establishment of formal British authority in New Zealand, both to protect British subjects and to regulate the increasingly complex relationships between Europeans and Maori. However, any assertion of British sovereignty would require some form of agreement with Maori leaders, as Britain recognized that Maori were the indigenous owners of the land and possessed legitimate authority over their territories. The British government's growing interest in New Zealand reflected both humanitarian concerns about the treatment of indigenous peoples and strategic concerns about the potential for other European powers to establish competing claims in the region. Reports of exploitation and abuse of Maori by unscrupulous European traders and settlers created pressure for British intervention to protect indigenous rights and maintain British moral credibility. At the same time, rumors of French interest in establishing settlements in New Zealand created strategic imperatives for Britain to assert its own claims before competitors could establish themselves in the region. The stage was being set for the most significant event in New Zealand's post-contact history, the negotiation and signing of the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. This document would attempt to establish a framework for ongoing European-Maori relations and would create the legal foundation for British colonial government in New Zealand. However, the treaty would also become the source of ongoing controversy and conflict, as its terms were interpreted differently by different parties, and as its promises were honored or violated in the years that followed. The period leading up to the Treaty of Waitangi was marked by increasing urgency on all sides. Maori leaders were becoming increasingly concerned about the growing European presence and its effects on their communities, while European settlers were demanding protection and legal certainty for their investments and property. The British government was under pressure to assert formal authority in New Zealand before other European powers, particularly France, could establish competing claims. The complex negotiations that led to the Treaty of Waitangi reflected the competing interests and conflicting worldviews that had developed during the decades following first European contact. Maori leaders sought to maintain their authority and protect their people's interests while gaining access to the benefits that European contact could provide. European settlers wanted security for their property and investments along with the familiar legal and political institutions of British civilization. The British government wanted to establish sovereignty over New Zealand while avoiding the costs and conflicts that had characterized colonial expansion in other parts of the world. The appointment of Captain William Hobson as British consul to New Zealand in 1839 marked the beginning of formal British efforts to establish sovereignty over the country. Hobson arrived with instructions to negotiate a treaty with Maori chiefs that would transfer sovereignty to the British Crown while protecting Maori rights and interests. The treaty would need to be acceptable to both Maori leaders and British authorities, a requirement that would prove extremely difficult to fulfill given the fundamental differences between European and Maori concepts of sovereignty, land ownership, and political authority. Hobson's mission represented a new approach to British colonial expansion that attempted to balance imperial interests with humanitarian concerns and indigenous rights. The instructions he received from the Colonial Office reflected lessons learned from earlier colonial experiences, where the failure to establish clear agreements with indigenous peoples had led to costly conflicts and ongoing instability. The British government hoped that a negotiated treaty could provide a foundation for peaceful colonial development while avoiding the violence and exploitation that had characterized European expansion in other parts of the world. However, the success of Hobson's mission depended on his ability to bridge fundamental differences between European and Maori understanding of political authority, territorial control, and legal relationships. The concept of sovereignty that was central to European political thought had no direct equivalent in traditional Maori society, while Maori concepts of tribal authority and collective decision-making were foreign to European legal and political traditions. The challenge of creating a treaty that would be meaningful and acceptable to both sides would test the limits of cross-cultural communication and diplomatic skill. The drafting of the treaty involved complex negotiations between British officials, missionaries who served as translators and cultural interpreters, and Maori leaders who represented diverse tribal interests and perspectives. The final document reflected compromises and ambiguities that would later become sources of conflict and controversy. The English and Maori versions of the treaty contained significant differences in meaning and emphasis. Differences that reflected the fundamental challenges of translating complex legal and political concepts between cultures with very different worldviews and institutional structures. The role of missionaries as translators and cultural interpreters in the treaty negotiations was crucial, but also problematic, as their own cultural biases and religious objectives influenced their understanding and translation of both European and Maori concepts. The missionaries brought valuable knowledge of Maori language and culture to the negotiations, but they also brought their own agenda for transforming Maori society according to Christian principles. Their translations inevitably reflected their own understanding of what would be best for Maori people, rather than simply conveying the exact meanings intended by either European or Maori participants in the negotiations. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed on February 6, 1840, at Waitangi in the Bay of Islands, with additional signatures collected at locations throughout the country over the following months. The treaty contained 3 main articles that addressed the transfer of sovereignty, the protection of Maori property rights, and the extension of British citizenship to Maori people. However, the interpretation and implementation of these provisions would prove contentious from the very beginning. The signing ceremony at Waitangi brought together Maori leaders from throughout the northern regions of New Zealand in what was probably the largest inter-tribal gathering in the country's history. The discussions and debates that took place during the days leading up to the signing revealed the diversity of Maori opinion about the treaty and the complexity of the issues involved. Some chiefs supported the treaty as offering protection and benefits for their people, while others opposed it as a threat to Maori independence and traditional authority. The fact that the treaty was eventually signed by a majority of the chiefs present reflected not unanimous agreement, but rather a pragmatic calculation that the benefits of association with Britain outweighed the risks of continued independence in a world increasingly dominated by European power. The first article of the treaty, as understood by British officials, transferred complete sovereignty over New Zealand to the British Crown, giving the British government full authority to establish laws, institutions, and policies throughout the country. However, the Maori version of the treaty used the word Kawanatanga, which conveyed a more limited concept of government authority that would not necessarily override traditional tribal sovereignty and customary law. This difference in understanding would become a source of ongoing conflict as British authorities asserted powers that many Maori believed they had not agreed to surrender. The translation challenges that created these different understandings of the treaty's first article reflected fundamental differences between European and Maori concepts of political authority. The European concept of sovereignty implied complete and exclusive authority over a defined territory and all the people within it, while traditional Maori political organization was based on overlapping and complementary forms of authority that could coexist without necessarily conflicting. The word Kawanatanga that was used in the Maori version of the treaty suggested a form of government authority that would operate alongside rather than replace traditional tribal authority, creating expectations that would prove incompatible with British colonial practice. The second article of the treaty guaranteed Maori full exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands, forests, fisheries, and other properties, while also giving the Crown the exclusive right to purchase Maori land. This provision was intended to protect Maori from exploitation by private land speculators while ensuring that land could be acquired for European settlement through government-regulated purchases. However, the implementation of this provision would prove highly controversial, as the Crown's land purchasing policies often failed to respect Maori concepts of collective ownership and customary rights. The land provisions of the treaty reflected British attempts to balance competing interests and concerns in ways that would prove difficult to implement in practice. The guarantee of Maori land rights was intended to address humanitarian concerns about indigenous welfare and to honor British commitments to respect indigenous property rights. However, the Crown's exclusive right to purchase Maori land was designed to facilitate European settlement while preventing the kind of fraudulent and exploitative land deals that had characterized European expansion in other parts of the world. The practical implementation of these land provisions would prove problematic because they assumed that Maori concepts of land ownership could be easily translated into European legal frameworks. The treaty's guarantee of Maori property rights was based on European assumptions about individual or corporate ownership that did not correspond to traditional Maori concepts of collective tribal ownership and spiritual relationships with land. The Crown's land purchasing policies would often involve negotiations with individual chiefs or small groups of tribal members, rather than with the broader tribal communities that traditional Maori law required to be involved in decisions about land transfers. The third article of the treaty extended the rights and privileges of British citizenship to Maori people, theoretically giving them equal status under British law and equal access to British legal protections. However, the practical implementation of this provision would prove limited, as Maori often found themselves subject to discriminatory laws and policies that treated them as second-class citizens despite their theoretical equality. The citizenship provisions of the treaty reflected liberal British ideals about equality and individual rights, but they also assumed that Maori people would abandon their traditional social and political organization in favor of European models of individual citizenship. The concept of British citizenship implied individual rights and responsibilities that were foreign to traditional Maori concepts of collective identity and tribal membership. The practical implementation of these citizenship rights would require Maori people to navigate European legal and political systems that operated according to principles and procedures that were often incompatible with traditional Maori values and practices. The signing of the Treaty of Waitangi marked the beginning of a new era in New Zealand history, one characterized by the gradual establishment of British colonial institutions and the progressive integration of New Zealand into the British Empire. However, it also marked the beginning of ongoing struggles over the interpretation and implementation of the treaty's provisions, struggles that would define New Zealand politics and society for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of the treaty saw rapid changes in New Zealand's political and legal landscape. The establishment of British colonial government brought new institutions, new laws, and new forms of authority that often conflicted with traditional Maori systems of governance and social organization. European immigration increased dramatically, putting new pressures on land and resources and creating new sources of tension between European and Maori communities. The transformation of New Zealand from a collection of independent Maori tribal territories to a British colony represented one of the most rapid and comprehensive examples of colonial transformation in the 19th century Pacific. Within a few decades of the treaty's signing, European settlers had established towns and cities throughout the country. European laws had replaced traditional Maori legal systems in most areas, and European economic systems had become dominant in most sectors of the economy. However, this transformation was incomplete and contested, with ongoing tensions between European and Maori communities over land, authority, and cultural values that would continue to shape New Zealand's society for generations to come.